Dr. Pamela Morris Perez is a developmental psychologist and a professor of applied psychology at New York University, which I don't know if we all know is an unbelievably big deal. Her 17-year-old daughter died by suicide, and this professor and mom has launched a center called Arcadia, a research center for adolescent interconnected approaches for suicide prevention. And she is a champion for honesty and courage and the need for us to learn to care and carry one another. Pamela, I've been really looking forward to this for such a long time, and I feel my own inadequacy when I was even trying to come up with a question. So just like, I fully encourage you. This is a community of learners, and you are so welcome to teach me as we go along.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I wondered if we could just start with your beautiful kid and what she was like when she walked into a room.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, because I love talking about Frankie. I could do it all day, which I won't, because I know we don't have time. You know, she was this amazing kid, and I know, like, I'm completely biased because I'm her mom, but she was just incredibly warm and generous. And actually, interestingly, I dreamt about her about a week ago. I almost never dream about her. And I told her I was going to be on this podcast. And I said, I'm going to talk about you. And she's like, she looked at me, she was like her brown curly hair and big brown eyes and, you know, like really cool sneakers matching her outfit. And she goes, what are you going to say about me? and I was like, I'm going to say how warm you are and how like emotionally present you are, and you know, and that you were so snuggly. You know, she used to like I'd like walk her to the subway on the way, to, you know, on her way to school, on my way to work, and she'd like slip her arm into like crook of my elbow, and then, you know, and we'd get into this sort of really insightful conversation about, you know, I don't know, something she had observed or something she was reading in school. And then, you know, like the fountain would be on in Washington Square Park, or there'd be snow like left over from the night before, and she'd like run ahead like she was 5 years old again, like jump on top of the snow pile and be like, there's snow. And like look at you to like join her in that glee. She was like both a like kid and a like wise adult, all in a teenage body in this sort of wonderful way. So yeah, she was a great kid, and I could talk about her all day.
Sounds like she was very good at reading other people. And also that she had a lot of layers that must have been hard to kind of be able, with sensitive people, I imagine there's just kind of a lot going on the surface and then so much more going on under the surface. I think a lot of parents worry that they're not always sure how to interpret their kids. How did you feel like you were seeing all the layers or not?
So Frankie, I always thought was sort of, I used to say she was overly empathic. You know, she'd leave a movie, and partly I think it was the sugar from the, you know, whatever, but, you know, she'd walk out the door of a movie theater and just like burst into tears as, you know, she just felt things really deeply. And I think what I think I understood at the time was that meant that she was so open to like everybody's pain and the world's pain. What I didn't realize until after now, with sort of the grief side of this, is that when you are more open, you actually invite people's stories. You must get this all the time, right? Where people come to me and tell me things that people I've known forever are telling me things that I didn't know about them. Because when you're empathic, people want a space to share. And so I think she got a lot of that.
I see.
And yeah, I mean, and you know, she was an easy kid to be around for so long, you know, until, you know, depression and anxiety really sort of hit her about 6 months before she died. So,
I had a conversation recently with someone, with a lovely author named Stephanie Wittels Wax, and she described after the death of her brother, like a stage of what she called like manic investigation. I thought that was I never thought of that as like a stage of grief, but they're like, I need to know, I need to figure this out, I need to be the detective. Is that an experience you went through?
So I will say, so there are no stages of grief. So
yes, of course. I know, I totally know what I'm saying. No, I don't believe in stages of grief.
But
I just always want
but
layers.
So what happens with suicide loss, what happens with suicide loss is that it's tangled up in a whole bunch of other really negative emotions. So you don't just feel the sadness of the loss. You also feel anger at the world that your, loved one was taken from you too early. You feel a huge amount of shame. I remember walking outside to walk my dog and feeling like I was wearing a big red letter S on my body, that I really sort of, here's proof that I failed as a parent, right? My kid died by suicide. I felt, you feel, there's the PTSD, obviously, the trauma of it all, but there's so many other sort of negative emotions, and there's the what happened. And I think what basically is happening is that I think like we all have these narratives of our lives. So Jonathan Adler at Olin College talks about how we build a narrative of our identity, and it's related to a master narrative of the world, right? And it's a reconstructed past, a perceived presence, and an imagined future. And
tell me that one more time,
sorry,
because I love it.
Reconstructed past,
Yes.
perceived present,
Yeah.
imagined future.
I like
and it
that.
makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And by age 50, like I've got a story of who I am.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden this thing happens to you in the present. And then you're like, well, now it doesn't line up with who I thought I was, who I thought our family was, who I thought she was, right? I mean, even though she was struggling, you still don't think suicide can touch you.
Yes.
And so what happens then is that to fill that space, to make sense, you pull on all these negative memories. So you remember really well all of the things, you didn't say, the times you weren't your best self, right? Even if you did it 2 or 5% of your time, it like balloons to take up 95% of your brain space. And you've got to kind of sift through all of that. There was this moment, it was like, and I thought it was like 6 or 9 months after, and then I was looking in this journal where I write notes about sort of reflections on grief and reflections on suicide. And I realized it was 15 months after Frankie died. I had a day that was just pure grief, like unadulterated, like untinged with all this other stuff.
Yeah.
No other emotions in it. And it felt actually like a gift. And that was so weird. I was like, this is the curse of suicide, because just missing her, just profoundly missing her, felt calmer than all the other swirling thoughts, all the noise. And it takes so long to get through that.
Wow.
It took, for me, like the first 1.5 to 2 years to consistently not have that, the swirling thoughts. And you can't rush it. It just needs its time to like process it, so that eventually you get to the space where you're like, I now can live in a world where I get that, like, we were a good family and she was a great kid and she died by suicide. Like both those truths can still exist now, but it takes so long to get there.
Yeah. I even really like the words that you're using that I wouldn't have thought to put together, like suicide loss is such a, I never hear that phrase, but that's perfect.
Yeah, so I call myself a suicide loss survivor now, and it's a word that some people use in the community, sort of like a survivor of trauma, right, essentially.
What do you think that opens up for people when they can say that about themselves? Like what other labels does that kind of like scoot aside? I can't even think of any language, because maybe that's the problem.
So I found it really helpful to have a label. When I remember when my therapist said something like suicide loss survivor, and I was like, oh, there's a word for who I am? Because there's there's orphans and widows. There's no even word for a mother that lost a kid, right? We don't even have a label. Right? And then on top of it, like losing someone to suicide, like you need something to be like, this is who I am, hello world. Like, so you don't have to be like, go through your entire story every time.
You're right, I hadn't even thought of like the entire purpose of the right label is not to have to rehearse the whole story.
Right.
And to get to the right conclusion together.
Exactly. And it's really important, that shift from, the first whatever year, 2 years, whatever it takes, 3, 4, 5, to moving from the death, the sort of perseverating around the death, to the moving to the life, right? Because once you can get through that and get the sadness up, then you can start also remembering the good memories. And then you can start on this side of it, living not for why they died, but why they lived, right? And you can pull that forward. And it's why I love talking about all of the good memories, and it's
Yeah.
why I don't, it's
Totally.
much harder to talk about the end stage.
Yeah, and it sounds like in a way
know.
more appropriate to talk about the life than.
Well, and then at least it's not that suicide isn't part of who she was, but it's not the only part.
Yes.
Right? It puts it back in the right perspective. She lived
Yeah.
for 17 years.
Yes.
And so many of those years were really
Yeah.
powerful and good and amazing.
Yeah, and radiant and smart and funny
really
and, like-
smart and all the stuff.
Yeah.
And then, yes, and she died by suicide. Like, both of those truths are
Yeah.
there.
Can you tell me that again too about like died by suicide as
Oh, yeah.
opposed to committed suicide?
Yeah. So the suicide community feels really strongly, I agree with this, so I feel really strongly that to not use the word committed. And the reason why is that committed comes from suicide's history as a crime and a sin, right? You commit crimes, right? And it came from, sorry to say,
Yeah.
the church, right?
Yes,
was part
as
of
being
it
the
that
thing
then
that places
moved
you
it
outside.
into,
Yeah.
common law, actually, where it was against the law to attempt suicide. And people that died by suicide, I have this picture that I show often in my talks because I saw it and I was like floored by it. It's a church in England, and it has a line in the grass where there used to be a fence between the tombstones of everyone that died by every other cause and the people that died by suicide, the tombstones, because those are largely unmarked graves, no last rites, etc.
Yeah.
And so that word comes from that, and that's why we say died by
Yeah.
other diseases, heart attack, pancreatic cancer, what have you.
Yeah.
Died by suicide, I sort of use it in the same language.
You have this beautiful way of describing like what suicide is.
Yeah. So it's not about wanting to die. It's about wanting to avoid severe emotional pain.
Yeah.
So just the same way that we are I think for a lot of people, they look at suicide and they think that feels unfathomable. Like it feels antithetical to what we understand about being human, right? We have a basic instinct about living. And so what is this about dying, choosing to die, if it's choice?
Yeah.
And there's a huge
sure.
debate about that. So, but it really is just like the way in which we are hardwired to pull our hands away from a burning stove. We avoid physical pain. We are also hardwired to avoid emotional pain.
Yeah.
And this is about deep, unrelenting emotional pain that feels like there's no other way out.
Yeah.
And so the trick is in the prevention side, is really around how do we give somebody a way for other ways to relieve their emotional pain. But it's not about wanting to die, which is I think what we all think of.
I think people will find that very helpful too. Because I just know from physical pain, I always have two thoughts is one, this is never going to end.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced of it.
Yeah.
And then two, it creates this real time wormhole.
Yeah.
And then I'm absolutely certain of despair and I want it to stop.
Yeah.
And I can only make the analogy, but I
think it's
imagine
very
that's
similar.
a lot less like choosing for me, or a lot less like, it's just, it's hard to understand yourself. I feel like you lose the future. It's gone in a second.
Yeah. So it's a very similar thing as I understand it.
Your ability to be the mom and the professor is like really wonderful to hear you think, because you have so much compassion for our emotional response, our like the unfathomableness. Also just, all grief is this like love sickness in which it is very hard then to apply an academic analysis. It sounds like really loving and understanding your kid caused you to grow into new parts of your academic expertise in a pretty amazing way.
Yeah, so I did. I started reading a lot about suicide, partly because I wanted to understand what Frankie was going through.
Yeah.
I really wanted to understand what it was for her. I had almost no experience with loss, really no experience with loss. My parents are still living, my siblings are still living, I've not lost a close friend.
Yeah.
So Frankie was my first loss, which was kind of a whammy in a way. but it also meant that I really wanted to understand what she was going through. And so I started reading. And honestly, what made me at first kind of really angry was I couldn't find her in it, and I couldn't find our family in it. It felt, I couldn't find her empathy and her light. And so that felt really challenging for me. It's not, I just want to say that, like, the work part of it is not healing. Like, it's helpful and it's useful.
Do you find you really hate it when, because people are like, isn't this just like therapy? I'm like,
Right,
no, it's
kind of
really not.
hard. Yeah, it's really kind of hard. So, like, I think of it like that I'm on a seesaw, and, like, there's the grief,
Yeah.
and it helps, the work helps balance the seesaw so I don't fall into the hole of grief and despair, right?
That makes complete
Right?
sense to me.
But it's not the warm blanket thing, right?
No, who thought it was the warm blanket?
But we all are,
they
like,
do,
purpose, right?
and I think in a way, I don't know. I think people love to imagine that as you're telling them the story, it's not as much of a gift as it is because it's helping you.
Right.
No, it's gift.
Right. Yeah, right. You love this redemptive narrative, right? That, like, exists in the
And
world.
it was part of my healing.
Right.
You're like,
Yeah, kind of not, but that's okay.
I guess one thing in which I find that the both sides helps is it does radically change your worldview.
Yes.
I wouldn't say it's like making my heart glow to know things I wish I could unknow.
Right, yes.
But it has really changed my worldview.
Yes. And I will say that what I bring from the grief side into the prevention side is I have so much empathy for parents of kids who are struggling with suicidal thinking, which I don't think we recognize the sort of trauma that's happening to families when they realize their kid is suicidal. And that is traumatic and difficult, and it's different than grief, but it is, that is really important. It's rough.
Yeah.
So that, and the compassion for kids who are struggling, and sort of still hope for all of them, and all of that too.
One of the things I have noticed about being on the sadder side of things, in terms of topics, is that I think people worry that the more they engage with, like, you tell someone you've had a diagnosis, and then there's kind of a concerned trying to find the reasons, and this is in the most uncharitable version, why it's me and not them.
Yes, of course, the othering thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's and then there's also the desire to learn. But I imagine that with suicide, you have that times a million of, like, please don't tell me more about that.
Right.
What do you think people are most afraid of when they engage with your work?
Yeah, so there's lots of the othering, and I think especially around suicide, and especially around anything that we don't understand the causes of, actually. If you read the history, like Susan Sontag stuff about cancer.
Yes, which cancer you have determines people's compassion.
100%, and the ways in which we used to write in the newspapers back in the 70s that depression caused cancer. Because people that had cancer had been depressed before they got the cancer, so it must have been the causal frame. And again, I think it was all a way to say, like, this thing that I don't understand and I can't predict, how do I make it not happen to me?
Yeah.
Right?
There's another version, it sounds, that I think is equally, like, it's so rampant right now, but there's a real repression theory about how if you have any kind of negativity, that it will create physical symptoms, and then they apply kind of like a Freudianism plus positive thinking. But the language is so, I mean, it's a real grab bag of, like, once I know this information, then it'll somehow be in my body, which is genuinely not true.
Right.
It's just kind of but then therefore I should not learn about difficult topics.
Right. Yeah, and I think suicide in general, like, everybody's scared to say the word. Right? We're scared to talk about it. We're scared to think about it. We're really scared if somebody's thinking about it near us. We don't want to touch it.
It sounds to me like one of the most comforting things that you say to people, though, is that talking about it does not, in fact, increase the
Yeah.
likelihood of
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So, but the sad thing is that was research that was done 20 years ago, right? So in 2005, Maddie Gould did this wonderful, she's from Columbia, did a randomized trial, like nice study, right? Randomized one set of kids to ask the question, one set of kids to ask a different set of questions, followed the kids,
Yeah.
no more thinking about it. And in fact, the kids that were more depressed, actually there was a reduction in distress. And then it was, there's been meta-analyses and this and that and the other thing. And the way I think about it, and I think the crime of the suicide field is that we've not figured out how to get that out into the public. And I think the reason is we haven't given people a frame for believing those findings. So as an early childhood researcher, the way I think about it is, you walk into a preschool classroom and I'll say you hear your teacher say something like, "Hey Johnny, I see you're really angry," or, "Oh, you must be really frustrated." And teachers do that because we believe that if you label an emotion, you can regulate it better, right? And we know that for 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds. But somehow when kids get to be teenagers, we're not explaining the difference between sadness and depression, stress, anxiety, panic attacks. Those are different emotional experiences.
Yeah.
And suicidal thinking, right? And so we don't talk about it. And then they have no space to explore it. Like, why am I feeling so shitty right now?
Yeah.
And then, and they're not differentiating their emotions, and they don't know when they're starting to come on, right? All of the stuff
Yeah.
that we know how to do with little kids, we forget when kids are all of a sudden presented with 1,000 different emotions.
That
right?
is a great argument.
Yeah.
For parents who are starting to try to tease out some of the distinctions between complicated, unhappy emotions,
Yeah.
what are some red flags or what are some signals of distress that you might identify?
Yeah, so I could tell you the warning signs, but I'm also going to say that the truth is you can't really, we as researchers, 50 years of research, we can't predict suicidal thinking. So, and most of it just looks like regular teenage angsty behavior. So I don't know. I like I said, there are some telltale signs, which is kids saying I don't know why this matters, but kids say that too, right? Giving away your possessions, if kids are saying I don't need this anymore, something that's really special to them. They say disengaging from social activities, but you could have a kid like Frankie who doesn't disengage, who still is able to have really close friends. So there are kids that are able to present without and really keep that suicidal thinking to themselves. So I tell parents that they should ask the question directly. And because if we don't know who's thinking about it, the only way we can really get into it is to ask and talk about it. You can say hey, I've noticed you've, stopped going to soccer practice, and I just have to ask, are you thinking about suicide at all? And then you want to stop, because the next thing you don't want to say is, of course you're not. Or, I'm so sorry I asked, right? My I was at the doctor for a regular checkup thing, and they were like, I'm sorry, because I said, I lost my daughter to suicide. And they were like, I'm sorry, I have to ask you, but are you suicidal? And I'm like, don't be sorry, you have to ask. Just ask the question.
You're do you know my job?
So and I know it's really scary, and practice it in the mirror, but you do want to ask the question directly, because if you just say, are you feeling really sad? First of all, you can be anxious. And, I mean, depression and suicidal thinking are not the only two things that are paired together. Lots of times suicidal thinking can exist without depression, without anxiety. Right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it does co-occur with a whole slew of other mental health challenges sometimes, but it is its own thing
So
all
you
by
need
itself.
to be able to say,
are
you thinking about suicide?
Then you just want to listen and hear what the kid has to say. Because what you've done then by asking the question directly, even if they're like, no, Mom, forget it. A month from now, 6 months from now, maybe they are struggling. They know now that you've broken the ice. They can come to you.
Yeah.
On top of it, if they end up, wanting to help a friend, you've now modeled for them how do you ask the question. Right? Because they've got friends who they've probably seen these signs from before. And it's why I actually think we need to start with sort of the kid generation in particular.
And how early is too early to ask that question.
You know, we're starting to do things with younger and younger kids now to understand their, you know, sorry to scare you. I don't want to scare people,
No,
but like, you know, they're, you know, more and more 10 to 14-year-olds are dying by suicide now than had been before. It can be, it's, first of all, kids do think about death early. Can I just say that? Like, it's not unusual to have a conversation about death.
Yeah.
And what's basically, and that's a good thing, right? We actually think that it's appropriate to think about existential questions, right, in adolescence. Why am I here?
Yeah.
You know, the fact that we're mortal is why we, like, right, lean into life, right?
Yeah.
So there's that too.
Yeah.
And the way I talk to parents about doing it is, imagine your kid came to you and said, I have a headache. You would know how to ask a set of questions to decide whether they are, you know, whether they just didn't drink enough water that day, whether they needed glasses, you know, because they'd been reading too much, or whether you need to bring them to the pediatrician because they need to see a neurologist. And you would say, like, how much does it hurt? How often has it hurt this way? You know, last time you felt this way, what did you do right before? What were you doing right before? What did you do after that happened? What made it go away? Last time it hurt like this, what did you do? And what's nice about that is you're allowing the kid to articulate the things that they're already doing that is easing that emotional pain. And we were back in the emotional pain a while ago.
Yeah.
Right? We're helping to sort of bring that all out.
That sounds so much more curious than the way I think people imagine that conversation would go.
And the truth is, it's okay. It's not okay to think about suicide, but it is okay to explore thinking about suicide, in that kid isn't definitely at risk because they're thinking about it. The kids that are most at risk, that we have to be the most concerned about, is if they're thinking about suicide, they have a plan to attempt and they have access to that plan. Those are the kids we're most worried about. So just because the kid is thinking does not mean they need to be hospitalized today. And in fact, that's why they're worried about talking to grown-ups about it, because they're scared they're going to land in the hospital and all their clothes are going to be taken away from them and their phone's going to be taken, like everything's good. They're going to lose all agency.
Yeah.
And the truth is, you just need to, like, sit and talk. And actually, the way to think about it is exactly the same way. Like, when you want somebody to talk to you about, you know, all the things you've been through, you don't want somebody to tell you what to do, right? You don't want somebody to, you know, you have all these people on your show, right, that always have had really hard things happen to them. And I, like, as someone who's experienced grief, like, I didn't want people telling me, like, you should go do X, right? Or this is why it happened, or anything, right? Right? You want someone just to listen.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I found really useful is, and it's a fiction, so you'll bear with me for a second, but Kate DiCamillo has this book, Magician's Elephant. Do you know that story?
No, tell me.
So it's about a little boy, and he, anyway, I won't tell you the whole story, but he sees, a fortune teller tells him to go see this elephant to be able to find his sister. And the elephant is deeply depressed because it's been conjured into this town by a magician, and and it's being held in the castle, and all the townspeople are traipsing to see this elephant, and so the elephant's deeply depressed and says, like, I don't want to live, just essentially being suicidal. The boy lines up to go see the elephant, gets to the front of the line. He says, elephant, open your eyes, like, I have to ask you something. Please open your eyes. And finally the elephant opens its eyes, and he sees the deep despair in the elephant's eyes. And what Kate DiCamillo writes is that in that moment, the elephant felt like he felt known and understood, and he felt something akin to hope. And what I love about that is that the boy didn't do anything. He just saw the elephant in its pain. And when you see somebody's pain, they're not alone in it anymore. Like, as humans, we deeply need to be seen and understood and with people. And I think if you can sit with your kid in their pain and see that pain and try to understand it with them and say, like, you don't have to have all the answers. You can just be like, I don't understand this either. We're going to figure it out together. You know? there's something about sitting with someone in their pain that's like a really valuable
Yeah.
process, I think.
Like goes to that deeper place.
Goes
And you
to
can
the deep-
feel it.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, then you just, and I think there's this way in which someone wrote on a listserv once, which I thought was sort of brilliant. She's like, you know, in the end, the only person that can save somebody is themselves. But if you can sit with them for a moment in their emotional pain and they feel helpless and hopeless. And if you can feel helpless and hopeless with them, then for that moment they're not alone. And that may help them find their reasons for living. Right? It's just the like little bit of hope.
Yeah.
Right?
I can also hear how much the formula idea breaks down.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wish I could say that everyone's kids would be protected and there was only one kind of suicidal kid and you'd know it if you had it. But there's not, you know, and I think we create visions of these because it's, you know.
Because it gets to that unthinkable thought.
And then I don't have to let it have it touch my family.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It just struck me the way you were describing the importance of like practicing asking questions about suicide is that it feels like you're bubble wrapping them to say like that stuff doesn't exist, like that will never touch you. Because of course we want to say that.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that is not that's not the protective kind of love that we always imagine it is.
I think it's that, and I think the protective kind of love also makes you want to fix it, right?
Yeah.
You want to pick them up and put the Band-Aid on the knee that you could do when they were 2.
Yeah.
And the problem is that for them to feel agency, you need to not. So it's like, it's just like the tightrope of a normal adolescence.
Yeah.
But like in extremes because the danger feels so much bigger, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I call this a trauma for the family. It is so scary for the family.
Yeah. I find so much of parenting literature sounds a lot to me like self-help literature, which has a really sometimes like easy peasy lemon squeezy attitude toward human suffering.
Yeah.
And I just find the way you're describing it really real, and the more real it is in a way, the more comforting it feels. Because there's all the trying, and then there's all this stuff that lies beyond our ability to try. And that is that's intense wisdom there. Knowing that distinction when it comes to the most important life and death issues.
That, and to be honest, like, it makes you, and suicide really, in some ways, like, took the wind out of my sails as a parent, in part because, and in some ways that was terrible, and in some ways it made us pause, like with our son, like it made us pause and do this sort of step back with him that honestly was really, I think, helpful for him as he was sort of grieving also as well.
What did that step back look like? Where you're like, I can't control every part of your life?
Yeah, it's the like, I used to believe that, not that everything would be perfect, but that there was always a do-over. You know, I mean, like, you know, like you could always redo, and, you know, death, there's no redo over, right? You know, and it made me like, okay, like I you know, I always felt like I could figure everything out. Eventually.
No, I'm just thinking of the number of brands that is entirely predicated on that idea.
Yeah, right,
so
like,
I like, what you're saying is so countercultural, which I really appreciate.
And it really like made us just pause and look and watch. And for him, like, you know, he was 17, you know, they were so close as twins. They were really two halves of a whole. So like I described, right, was this sort of, you know, outgoing, like bubbly, you know, she was the humanist, she was the pixie. He was the lanky engineering quiet kid, right? You know, like they were the pair. And they were, and, you know, and as I said, like I hadn't experienced loss. So I had no playbook for parenting him through this.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what it would be like to lose your twin who he'd been with since the womb. Like he didn't know life without her. And we just like let him lead, which turned out to, I mean, he was also 17, but it turned out to be really good for him. He, you know, he had decisions he had to make. Like it was 3 weeks before their high school graduation.
Come on.
So, you know, he had to decide, did he still want to go to prom and senior trip or not? Which he decided to do, and we scaffolded, you know, like we made sure if he was going to go on senior trip, he could talk to his school counselor every day, and he had an out clause, he could like leave. But the other thing that happened was because we took a step back, other people stepped forward. So I remember after the funeral, we were standing on the like grassy area outside the building, and he was like in a clump of kids, you know, teen clump kids, right?
A teen
And,
clump.
you know how they are, like
They
you
do.
know, right?
They're like
You know,
magnet filings.
right? Yeah, totally. And he's like, I want to go off with my friends. And of course, the adults were all going back to our apartment, but he had lived through like the day before we had done the whole open apartment thing, and like hundreds of adults had like traipsed through and hugged him, and it was rough. And I didn't want to, and I was like, okay, that's fine. I said, but I need to know you get home okay. And one of his friends, this kid, blonde hair, blue eyes, like steps forward, looks me straight in the eye, and was like, I'll make sure he gets home. And I was like, okay.
So touching.
It was like this really sweet
Right.
kid. And I was like,
Like
okay,
this-
I trust. I've been
Yeah.
trusting in the world. You know, and the same thing, we dropped him off to this, you know, trip to Costa Rica for a senior trip at
Oh
the
my
airport. And
gosh.
this girl, like, not even like that close a friend of his, you know, like chatting with her friends, and she just like sticked her arm around him. And I was like, he's gonna be taken care of. And, you know, of course, we got him a really good therapist and the whole thing, and watched really carefully. But the result of that sort of stepping back meant he eventually came forward, and like I'd be hanging out at dinner, like after dinner, washing the dishes or something, and come to get ice cream or something, and you'd get into this conversation about, you know, regrets or about a Frankie memory or whatever, but like, you know, standing there in our kitchen. But not because I like went and we like, we have to talk right now.
Dug it out of him.
Right, you
knock,
know?
knock, knock.
Right, like it was, you know, weeks or months after, I don't know when.
Yeah.
And
But letting it bubble up.
letting it bubble up.
Yeah.
And then because my wife and I grieved really differently, and because we articulated that difference, I think it gave him permission to grieve in his own way. So he found his own way through it all. And then he taught me things also. So, I mean, he went on the senior trip and he packed, he took out of the closet, he didn't, you know, we were packing like the night before, and he didn't have a raincoat that fit him on his, you know, 17-year-old boys, like, you know, they grow out of stuff, right? And like, we didn't have a raincoat. And he grabs Frankie's raincoat and puts it into the suitcase. And I'm thinking, like, what if he loses it? Like, wouldn't that, like I was, like, doing all this. And he, like, folds it up, puts it in the suitcase, and I was like, I'm just not going to say anything. And, you know, it was interesting. I texted a friend after, and she was like, it makes perfect sense. She goes, she's going to be hugging him the whole time he's there. And I was like, oh, thank you for that, because I needed the reframe, because I'm freaking out right now.
Yeah.
And he said now, like, he took really good care of it. He, like, there was stuff in the pocket he left there and, like, preserved. And he really, like, gave me permission to, like, I'm wearing Frankie's earrings, and I do that now.
You're wearing your earrings.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I feel
To like fold it into your own life instead of only just like Amber, like that feeling we have when we love someone and lose them and we kind of want to preserve them. But just to like fold that love into life sounds so beautiful.
Because then she keeps growing with, I mean, so with me, she
Yeah.
fills me, but she's still 17. What's been fascinating, like, he channels her. He, like, is still him. You know, we're almost 5 years out now, and he, like, carries her in this really beautiful way that's, like, totally beautiful and heartbreaking all in the same breath. And then her friends, who we're super close with now, like, we talk to them and they're like, yeah, she's still growing with us. And I feel like she gets, like, the pieces of her that are in all of them.
Yeah.
I don't know.
She's still growing with us is such a
Think so?
beautiful.
It's like the love she sent to them, like, ricochets to other, like,
That's really beautiful.
It's
Oh my gosh.
It's like a thing.
Oh my gosh.
It's so pretty. And as a parent who loses a kid, what you lose the ability to see your kids still have impact, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you don't get the chance to see, you
Yeah.
know, for the teacher to be like, they were such a great presence in the class, or they did
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And what instead I get now to see is sort of the way that she impacts them and they carry her. And that is at least some, you know, it doesn't replace her. It never will. But it certainly helps. It softens it a lot to see that.
Yeah, love becoming love, becoming love. When I was so sure I wasn't going to make it till the summer, I had this thought that I would step back a little bit in terms of my like desire to aggressively overparent.
Yeah.
And I thought now is probably the right time to practice other people having a relationship with my son. And I've seen it, that part feels like such a miracle to me because I can see how much that love became more love
Yeah.
that didn't require me.
Doing it.
Yeah. It's like this, whenever you get to see somebody else love your kid and then their love multiply, it's a pretty beautiful, it's a really beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing.
It always feels like a little miracle.
Oh my gosh. And it's what, you know, part of the reason we opened our house up to her friends was Frankie loved her friends so much.
Oh, that's so nice.
And we felt like she wanted us to take care of them. She would have wanted that. But now we get these gifts.
Yeah.
And sometimes these kids show up. We adopted a bench for at the cemetery because we couldn't do a tombstone. It just felt too.
I love a bench.
Yeah, a bench in a tree. Yeah.
Yeah.
It also is this little oasis by water. And so now when I go to braid flowers on it often, like every week or two, because it's like my centering space. And I find things that the kids have left there. And
It's
even
beautiful.
things that kids that don't go through us. So last May was year 4. Frankie died in early June. And I arrived and there was this little Ziploc bag on the back attached to the bench. And I opened it up, and I actually thought about it for a second because we have this thing of like, should we open things that are left there? Are they for us? They're for Frankie? And we decided if things aren't sealed, it's okay to look at. And I opened up this like letter that's in there, and it's actually a little note to the family too. So I was like, okay, it's legal, I'm allowed. And this kid described how, you know, Frankie taught them that friends could hug. And it was like so sweet. And it's not signed by a name, like it's like anonymously signed. But I'm pretty sure it's a kid that hasn't been through our apartment before.
That's so nice.
And I love that some kid found this bench. like, I'm like so happy. You know?
Will you tell me some of the like facts about
Helplines, like some of the kind of basic things that I don't think that I would know if I didn't like go out of my way.
Yeah. So there's lots of things now. So 988 exists as a 3-digit number people can call if they're struggling, if they're suicidal, and a parent can even call the number to be like, I'm really worried about my kid. They're not going to get to be the first person in line, right?
Yeah.
They might have to be on hold for a little. But they are there. What's interesting actually about helplines is they have a really interesting history that I think is helpful to understand what happens when you call.
Yeah.
So they were started by a priest actually, Chad Vera, in the 1950s. He had presided over the funeral of a young girl, a 13-year-old, who had died by suicide when she took her life when she got her first period. And so 17 years later, he was like, I'm never going to forget you. I'm going to do something right by you. He started accepting people he's like, people should have someone to talk to when they have questions, when they're stressed out. And so he started inviting people to come. He was really good at what he did. And this is a story that actually a junior colleague of mine tells, Yesham Iqbal, that he was so good that he hired volunteers to sit with the people in the office to like serve them tea or whatever. And then one day he opens his door and he realizes half of them are gone. And he realized that it wasn't him that they needed to see. They needed somebody to talk to, and the volunteers were doing just fine. And so he created this thing called befriending. And the early lines were called befriender lines. And in fact, I wish our 988 line was called a befriender line.
It would be so much less scary.
So much less scary. If I had like a wand, I would call it the befriender line. So it's based on active listening, empathizing, no giving advice, no counseling. They do a full risk assessment to figure out how much the person is in imminent risk,
Yeah.
right? To figure out whether they need to do something to keep somebody safe. But beyond that, then they are there to just listen. And the idea is having somebody just to listen to actually eases that emotional pain, right? It's
Yeah.
back to that, what we were talking about before.
Yes. That makes it sound like the word commiserating is exactly the right word.
Yeah, commiserating. Yeah, commiserating. I never thought of that. I like that. People can make their homes safer.
Yeah.
So
Tell me about that.
the analogy I use often is seatbelts, right? So we all put a seatbelt on. Most of the time, none of us get into an accident.
Yeah.
So we can all suicide-proof our homes, which means get lock boxes for medications.
Yeah.
Lethal over-the-counter stuff, things leftover medication from the last time you were at the orthodontist. Obviously for firearms, and it turns out that I used to think that if somebody wanted to die by suicide, or somebody that they would seek, that if you stopped one way, they would immediately go to another way. And I think our strong will to live means that when we can pause that for longer, for most people, not for everybody,
Yeah.
it can, and give them more chances to find their reasons for living, we delay it longer, it can help. And so it's why the safety stuff matters.
Yeah.
Nicely, they're starting to do a lot of things sort of in communities now.
Yeah.
Barriers on bridges and things like that as well.
Yeah.
The Golden Gate Bridge finally now has a netting, which is needed for people have been fighting for an inordinate number of years. And then there are, programs in schools that are increasingly happening now too.
Yeah.
We work with a wonderful nonprofit in Southern California that has kids make films in suicide prevention, like 1-minute films in mental health awareness and suicide prevention.
Yeah.
And then it means that they're talking to their friends,
Yeah.
because often the first person that will notice what's going on with a kid is probably a friend, right?
Yeah.
They're in schools. Kids are in schools a lot of the day, and more in school than they are at home.
Yeah.
So there's ways in which schools are a really important place for really supporting, prevention, even though teachers are doing way too much already.
Yeah.
But it's another space, to really talk directly to kids about,
Yeah.
they're supporting each other already. And the trick is, I think, as adults, we're not giving them the chance to know what to do with that information, right?
Yes. Yes. What a good argument.
Thank you.
I feel like every time you say something, like, oh my gosh, what an unbelievably helpful argument.
Like, they're already talking about it. They're already struggling. And what we're not doing is telling kids what to do. When do you break a code of silence? When is it too much, like, you can't keep this secret? Who's the adult that you can bring the kid to in the school building that's going to not immediately, once you say the word suicide, hospitalize you? Can you call 988 together, right? Or there's teen lines out in the West Coast, and where a kid will answer the phone, overseen by clinicians, older kid, it's overseen by clinicians, teen line and youth lines out in California and up in Portland. But 988 works everywhere.
Pamela, you've given me so many kinds of ways to think about why more language and like softer language is going to open up a lot of possibilities for connection with people. Like that makes it both less like a this than that, and so much more like, how can we include suicide in the way that we talk about our belonging to each other, how we love each other better, how we have maybe a lot more honesty around like when we see people creeping up to the edge of despair.
Yeah.
And I feel so grateful. This was a very emotionally expensive thing for you to do with me, and I feel incredibly grateful you chose to do it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's, obviously a really important topic. And Frankie would want me to do this, so it feels like the right reason to do it.
Oh, what a gift.